Keep
If
it going
anybody
as long as
doesn't
it's
know
interesting.
me, I'm Irene Kupta, and I'm the chair of the Western Mountain Senior College. And we want to welcome you all here. And before Steve introduces our speaker, I would like to ask you please, if you haven't already, to sign up. If you're not a member, let us know who you are, and we'll let you in on all our secrets and all our good programs that we do. There's a lot of literature up there that you can take. Again, welcome. And this, I forgot what I was supposed to say. We want to thank Gould Academy and especially Edison for helping us set up today. So now I'd like to introduce Steve Smith, who's going to introduce the speaker.
I am. Good afternoon, everyone. Immigration is certainly a historically important issue, and the way things are developing throughout the world today, immigration is right at the forefront of our news and something we all need to be interested in, care about, and learn more about. We're fortunate today to have Marcel Polak, one of our community members, with us to talk on that subject. Marcel, like many of us from away, could be considered an immigrant here in the Bethel area. And Marcel, unlike myself, has only been here full-time for 4 years. Marcel has been in the community since 1978 in the same piece of property, right, Marcel? So, and as I know many of you know, Marcel has been very active in the community. But Marcel has a wonderful family history that will be able to give us a new perspective on immigration, both historically and contemporarily, from the eyes of his family's experience. So, Marcel.
Thank you very much for all of you friends and family, friends and neighbors for coming, and I hope to make this interesting. First, I just want to introduce a few things. This is a very personal history, and the brochure described it as stories, but it should be better described as history. This is adapted from a blog that I wrote, which was a new experience for me. I don't consider myself a writer, and it was quite difficult for me to put it together, but it was important. The way I present it today may not be totally linear. There are a lot of sort of sub-stories that I may jump in and tell, and I prefer that this not be a one-way lecture. If there are questions or comments that are really important at the moment, rather than waiting at the end, please jump in. That would be appropriate. I want to also describe to you why it is very important for me to tell this story. Part of it is about the Holocaust, and within a generation, the survivors will be gone, and it will be up to witnesses. I consider myself a witness, having heard my parents' stories and scores of other survivors. So it is important for me to keep telling the story because, so the first thing I will tell you is I will not debate the Holocaust. Okay? Well, I mean, it's an issue. There are revisionists who have claimed that the Holocaust did not exist, doesn't exist, and original fake news. And to me, debating the Holocaust would be like debating gravity, so I won't do that. I'll start out. I've been long interested in the plight of immigrants and refugees in the United States and Europe. Immigration to the United States was a determining factor in both the Brexit vote in England and our recent presidential election. So I'll start out by saying that there are, unfortunately now, 60 million refugees in the world. That is the estimate. Many of those are due to war, and also many of them, probably even more from what I'm hearing, are due to climate change. And that will continue, and this is an issue that I think we do need to deal with. So I'll start out. I was born stateless in Paris, France, and that means that I was not a citizen of any country. and therefore lacked the important rights that you have as a citizen. And this was the result of tumultuous 19th and 20th century history that I'll talk about now. According to the United Nations, there are now 10 million refugees in the world that are stateless. So there's a continuing issue. During World War II, there were many as well. So in order to explain why I was stateless, I need to go back into some personal history. My father, born Polak, P-O-L-L-A-C-K, was born in Ruskova, Romania in 1914, in what was then the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. This was his father. He was drafted into the Austrian-Hungarian war in somewhere, we don't know exactly when, but around 1914, in the 1910s, and he never returned. We have no idea where he was buried, just disappeared like many others. This part of Romania that my father was born in is also known as Transylvania. It's the northern part of Romania. It has gone back and forth. The borders have changed. Many times it was part of Hungary during World War II. But when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire ended after World War I, there was no more citizenship in that empire, so my father was stateless. And that's where that started. My father, facing a poor economic future, basically decided to immigrate to France in 1929. France was a major place of immigration for Eastern European refugees who were fleeing at that point. For him, it was economic, I believe. There were just no opportunities in rural Romania. And basically, he probably came on some kind of a temporary visa. And this is a theme that you'll hear repeatedly. He overstayed his visa, didn't want to go back, and at some point was caught by the French, and they gave him a choice to be deported back to Romania or to join the French Foreign Legion. So he chose the French Foreign Legion. This was not a mythological unit. The French Foreign Legion was real. They were also in Vietnam and got beaten by in Vietnam. If you're watching the Vietnam story, you'll understand that the French Foreign Legion got out of there in the nick of time. So he that's where he wound up, and this was actually before World War II broke out. This is him. He's third from the left. He was stationed in North Africa. And essentially, this is where it gets a little complicated, and the story may again not be linear. In 1940, the Germans invaded France, and the Vichy government rolled over, essentially, and there was a government in exile led by de Gaulle. French Foreign Legion split, and there were regiments that were loyal to the Vichy government, which were collaborating with the Germans, and there were others that basically were under direction of de Gaulle and were fighting the Germans. So he did fight in North Africa. He was eventually captured in battle. Again, one of the things that I regret very deeply is, while I spoke to my mother about her experiences repeatedly and got great detail, I neglected to sit down with my father. So there are gaps in my history that I just don't know. But he was captured, was in a POW camp somewhere in Italy. He tells me that he escaped, and he made his way through the Allied lines all the way to northern Italy, and basically then could not go back to France because France was still being occupied. So he spent the rest of the war in Romania. I'm sorry, in Morocco. This is my grandmother, his mother, born in actually Ukraine, which is just right over the border, about 20 miles away. So my father had quite an extended family in this village of Roskovo. And in 1944, this is in May of 1944, all the Hungarian Jews, this was under Hungarian control at this time, all the Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. This was one of the last major deportations to Auschwitz. And if any of you have read any of Elie Wiesel's books, his village, the city of Szeged, is about 20 miles from Ruskova. So they were likely on the same transport. We actually, my wife and my daughter and I visited Auschwitz in 1999. Rachel was a 15-year-old Telstar student and took some of these photographs. Famous sign, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. The Germans were very good at propaganda. And of course the tracks leading up to it. Now, this is where I need to start talking a little bit about Americans' response. Remember, this is 1944, May of 1944. Essentially, Roosevelt, who is revered, and I have great respect for him, basically neglected to do anything. Back in 1942, there was a gentleman named Jan Karski, who was a Polish diplomat. He was in the underground. He was sent by the Polish underground, the government in exile, to visit world leaders and alert them about what was going on. And he went to Churchill, he went to visit Churchill. He actually met with Roosevelt, again, in 1942, and he had been smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto. He was basically reporting on what was going on there, and as well, a report was described about what was happening to Jews in Poland. This was done by the Polish government in exile. He met with Roosevelt. Roosevelt was fairly indifferent. He asked about horses. He didn't ask about the plight of the Jews. He also met with Felix Frankfurter, Supreme Court Justice at the time, Jewish, who basically later said that he thought that he couldn't believe him. He further clarified, said, I'm not saying he was lying, but I'm saying that I couldn't believe him. Just a lawyerly way of weaseling out of acknowledging what was going on. So the point that I want to make here is that Roosevelt and the Allies had years, 2 years at least, before all these, there were hundreds of thousands of Hungarian and Romanian Jews that were deported. Later in the war, this is May of 1944, that track line could have been bombed, and that would have disrupted the whole process. They didn't. And as a result, my grandmother, her parents, uncles, aunts, I can't even tell you how many cousins and were all killed in Auschwitz. Ironically, and I'll use that term unfortunately too many times, the Russians liberated Auschwitz in January of 1945. So really there was about, those Hungarian Jews had 6 months, 7 months in Auschwitz. That's one of the reasons Elie Wiesel survived. Again, my daughter Rachel took these pictures. There are some of the bunks still there, and it was pretty chilling for us to see this. This is I can't even describe to you what it feels like to go there. So my mother, her maiden name Henrietta Elter, born in Mannheim, Germany, she was kind of in a unique situation. She was born in Germany in 1920. Now there's another concept of citizenship that I'm going to talk about, and that's birthright citizenship. America has a very unique tradition, still ensconced in law, that if you are born here, even if your parents are illegal, you are automatically a citizen. That is not something that was universally done in most parts of the world. Germany was one of those places. So in Germany, you would take the citizenship of your parents. Her parents were born in Poland and came to Germany around 1910. so she would have officially been Polish. The problem was that Poland, at some point in the 30s, basically declared, if you haven't been to Poland in so many years, then we revoke your citizenship. So that rendered her stateless. Now, what was interesting about the stateless status is that people actually even had passports. Because obviously if you were stateless and you were in a country wanted to get you out of there. So you had to have travel documents. So they did provide travel documents. My mother experienced the beginnings of rise of Hitler, 1933. She remembers being in school and being taught racial theory, which essentially where the teachers would show cranial shots and shot of Jews and describe physical characteristics that would indicate being Jewish or not. And at one point she spoke up and resisted and was told very quickly to shut the hell up. She also experienced Kristallnacht, 1938. This was a night when the Nazis rampaged through Germany, including Mannheim, and burned synagogues down and destroyed many German stores. The reason it's called Kristallnacht is because it's shattered glass, and the two synagogues in Mannheim were burned down. This is my grandmother, born in Oswiecim. Now, Oswiecim sounds a little bit like Auschwitz, and that's because it is. She was actually born in the town of Oswiecim, where the concentration camp Auschwitz was built. And essentially, my mother had 5 siblings. One sibling, because they were actually I should back up. My grandfather, this is a whole other story I'm not going to get into, for different reasons left the family in the mid-30s and went to Italy. And she was left with 6 children, didn't have the resources, and one child, my uncle, was sent to an orphanage. He was the one who actually wound up in Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp near Berlin, and he was murdered towards the end of the war. The other, my mother had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, all of whom got out of Germany in time and went to Israel. So my mother and my grandmother, Leah Krieger, in October 22nd of 1940, all the remaining Jews in Mannheim were deported. Now, I don't have a map of Mannheim, but Mannheim is in southern Germany. It's actually fairly close to France. And it was actually to her fortune that she was sent to a concentration camp in France called Gurs. Gurs was a camp that was established in the Pyrenees in the 30s to house Spanish refugees escaping the civil war in Spain. And there were all these barracks that were established. And essentially, many people don't realize that there were concentration camps in France. They were not extermination camps. They were not even labor camps. They were detention camps. But the conditions were horrific. There was not a lot to eat. They were run by the French, not by the Germans. So they were French guards, not German guards. And essentially, oops, let me go back. Essentially, my mother, with the help of a priest who had actually been born Jewish, escaped Gurs, got out, and her mother stayed behind. And what happened in Gurs and all the other camps that were in France is that at some point, when they were emptied out, everybody went to Auschwitz. So my grandmother, born in Oswiecim, the town where Auschwitz was built, went to her death in Auschwitz. And unlike many people who went there and had no idea where they were, she would have likely known exactly where she was. The Germans kept extraordinary records. I actually have the documentation of the transport she was on and the date that she was sent, and as well the date that she was probably murdered. My mother was recaptured and was sent to another camp called Les Milles, which was near Marseille. She had met in Gurs my brother's father. They were not married, but he was in the resistance, and it was because of him that she survived. And when she got out of Les Milles and escaped, she was still in occupied France, and she was given fake identity papers from the resistance, and actually even a small stipend, again because of her partner. His name was Arthur Schneerer, and he made one of those horrible decisions that people sometimes have to make. His choice was to save his family, my mother and his son, my brother, or to stay in the resistance. He chose the resistance, and he was from Austria, so he spoke perfect German, and at some point, the family history is that he did some spying, went into a camp wearing German uniform, and at some point was captured. He went to Auschwitz, actually survived Auschwitz. When Auschwitz was being evacuated, the Germans had a forced march to Buchenwald. He even survived that. Went back to his home city of Vienna and died of tuberculosis that he had contracted in the camps. My mother now was in occupied France. My brother born in 1943. Not a good time for a Jewish male to be born. He was not able to be circumcised according to Jewish law, and she hid him out in different places, convents and whole different grouping of different places. And she tells the story numerous times being asked by the French police to show papers, and luckily the few times that she was stopped, she was probably stopped by those French police that were sympathetic. She spoke some French, but she basically claimed that she was from Alsace-Lorraine, which is a part of France that went back and forth to Germany, and they let her go, and she did survive. When the war ended, we went to Paris. She went to Paris, where she met my father, and I was born in an 18th century slum tenement. This is not the Paris of today that is chic and very nice. This particular tenement had no interior plumbing, the Turkish toilet on the floor, which were 2 holes in the floor for toilet. My father described having to kill big Parisian rats with a club on the stairs. So I'm going back now to the beginning. As I was born, I described my mother was stateless, my father was stateless, and so France, being one of those countries that did not recognize birthright citizenship at the time, basically I was stateless as well. That didn't last very long. I was lucky. My parents had now been in France long enough that they were actually able to be naturalized. So 6 months after I was born, I was naturalized. And so I do hold French citizenship, which is also European Union citizenship. And frankly, the one legacy that I have is back at the time when Jews were trying to get out of Europe, it was very difficult to get out. There were countries were not allowing, including the United States. I'll get into that a little bit more. But I want to have at least a front door and a back door. So having 2 passports grants me that. I was very fortunate to have been born in Paris after the war ended. And I missed by 7 years the Veldiv roundup of July 1942. This was infamous, and for those of you who ever go to Paris, I would encourage you to actually pay attention This is in the 3rd arrondissement. It's called the Marais. It's a very fashionable area right now, very chic, a lot of boutiques, but it has a dark past because in July of 1942, the French police rounded up 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children. So I want to be clear, these were not German police, this is the French police under the direction of the Vichy government, and basically they separated children from their mothers. These were mostly foreign Jews, by the way. They started with foreign Jews, and ostensibly this was to protect the Jews that were native born. Again, because as I described earlier, France was a source of immigration from Eastern Europe. There were a lot of immigrant Jews there. And this is a park that across the street from where I lived before we came to this country. This is a monument to the children as young as 1 year old who were sent to Auschwitz by the French. This was a horribly shameful episode. The French have taken many, many, many more years than the Germans, and I will talk about Germans and how they've dealt with what they've done. But the French took them years. It wasn't until 1995 that Jacques Chirac, president at the time, basically acknowledged that France was responsible. The French figured out all kinds of creative ways of not acknowledging their complicity. But it was the French who did it. They are responsible. It was actually the French National Railroad, the SNCF, that got paid per head to ship my mother, my grandmother, and these children and the Jews that were deported from France to their deaths. And it just in the last 3 or 4 years that the SNCF finally accepted responsibility and offered to pay reparations. But this was only after Stuart Eisenstadt, an Undersecretary of State under Carter, I believe, interceded because they wanted to bid on a high-speed rail system in Maryland, that they finally acknowledged and offered to pay reparations. But then they figured out how to avoid that, because it took them, from the time they agreed to the time they started paying, survivors were dying, and then I find out that the only people who could actually get reparations were those people who had actually been deported or their spouses. There weren't many left at this point. So after the war, there were many, after the liberation of Auschwitz and all these camps, there were still millions of refugees, not only Jews, but refugees who'd been, Europeans who'd been displaced because of the war, and they wound up in DP camps, displaced persons camps. This is one part of the history that is not as well known. These DP camps were essentially concentration camps, but without the killing. People were behind barbed wire. There were guards. They were not allowed to go anywhere. Many of them were trying to get out out of these DP camps to the United States, and it was very difficult for them. Countries again were not willing to take them. The conditions were so bad that Patton, who was in charge, General Patton, who was in charge of these DP camps, was actually fired by Eisenhower because of the conditions in these camps. So this is another part of our shameful history. So this is when war ends, people are still scrambling to try to find a place to live. Okay, now I'm going to go a little bit into immigration policy. Now you're probably wondering why I would have a slide of Bambi. Well, this is a very interesting part of history. The background of this movie. How many of you have seen Walt Disney's Bambi? I bet you everybody's seen it. Okay, you should see it again because the background was really very unique. It was done by an artist named Tyrus Wong. Tyrus Wang was a Chinese-American artist and kite maker. He died just last year at the age of 106. And I was very interested in his obituary because he was one of the first victims of one of America's first immigration policies. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusionary Act. And it was an act that was designed precisely to keep the Chinese out. He actually came to this country with his father and landed on the West Coast and was subject to this act. He was incarcerated as a young man for about a month before he was allowed in. And of course, he was the artist who did the background for Bambi. He was influenced by Sung Dynasty landscape painting. If you've ever seen Sung Dynasty landscape painting and you watch this background, you will see the similarities. So I was really struck by this, and this was the first law that was passed in America, basically being discriminatory. And this is one of the things that I will state unequivocally, is that America has had a long history of laws, immigration laws, that have been racist, prejudicial. They cross over Republican, Democratic administrations. This is not a Republican thing or a Democratic thing. It is just part of American history. And the next one was the Immigration Act of 1924, which was an act primarily aimed at restricting Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans, especially Italians. By the way, this issue of race is very interesting because at some point Italians were blacks, Greeks were blacks, because skin color is a major issue in the United States. And Italians, especially Southern Italians, were darker, and so immigration was geared towards them. This was also designed because of the fear of communism. Again, the Russian Revolution, 1917, and the start of communism, and so this act was designed to keep Eastern Europeans out, but also Italians. And then the Immigration Nationality Act of 1952, which continued this act, and this is the act that I was subject to. So now we'll go back to my family. It's early 1950s, and things in Paris are pretty bleak economically. And my father has family in Israel and in New York, but he wants to come to New York. So he goes to the American consulate in Paris and applies for immigration to the United States. Well, he's subject to this act. He's from Romania, and so Americans did not want Romanians and Eastern Europeans. Ironically, the Eastern Europeans were squeezed both ways. They were obviously invaded by the Germans, and then subsequently by the Russians. But it was very difficult for them to come into the United States after World War II. So after going to the consulate repeatedly, a friend of his says, well, where is your wife from? And he says, well, she's from Germany, but she's not a German citizen. Oh, well, the Americans don't care about that. So he goes back to the American consulate and applies for immigration under my mother's birthplace, Germany. Remember, she wasn't a German citizen, but the law was written as the country of origin. So, just to make it clear, it was easier post-World War II for Germans to get into the United States than Eastern Europeans who had been victims of the war. And in fact, America willingly allowed in no Nazis, actually facilitated their entry into the United States. Why? Very simply because as soon as World War II ended, our friendship and allyship with Russia ended, the Cold War started. Germans had great intelligence on the Russians. So especially some of these high-ranking Nazis would have had this important intelligence. America made it easier for Germans to come in. So we got in under the German quota, and actually I have my passport from that time, and it does say under the German quota. President Truman tried to veto this act. I'll let you read this. And you'll see the language in what his opposition is really some of the same language that you'll hear today. And as well, the next slide that I'm going to show you, because his veto was overridden. And this is what the opposition, the opposition stated. Please read this, because this is, again, you could be saying this today. Okay, well, we got in. We came on this boat, the SS Flandre, December 4th, 1953. Ellis Island was not operational at this point. We landed somewhere on the west side. And our first home in the United States was something sponsored by the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, HIAS, the acronym. It is now the Joseph Papp Public Theater. Now, when we got here, my father had about $300 to his name. There was no welfare. The Jewish agency gave us, I think, a month's rent somewhere in Bedford-Stuyvesant. My mother went to work in a sweater factory, sewing labels into sweaters, piecework. And my father worked in a matzah factory in New Jersey. They both eventually benefited from unions who basically saved their lives by providing a livable wage and health insurance. So even though my parents were very low middle class, had very few skills, at the time in the early 50s in Brooklyn, one could live relatively comfortably because we had health insurance given to the unions. Unfortunately, those same unions maybe a few decades later, became oppressive as the union leadership got into trouble for corruption and stuff. And we lived in East New York, in Brooklyn, a neighborhood in Brooklyn that is still not chic. It has escaped gentrification. But I was able to go to a public school that was excellent. New York City at the time provided excellent public education. I wound up moving actually out of Brooklyn in 1960 to a community called Far Rockaway, where I went to Far Rockaway High School, which I hadn't realized at the time was such an extraordinary high school. This particular high school graduated 3 Nobel laureates, including Richard Feynman, the physicist. There are some people that I'm not particularly proud of who went there, including Bernie Madoff, Carl Icahn, vulture capitalist. You may have heard about him. He's written up in the New Yorker recently. One of my classmates was Roy Bittan, the keyboard player for the East Street Band, and Bruce Springsteen. But it was an excellent education, and at the time when I graduated that public high school, the top 10% of every graduating class in New York City high schools were given free tuition to the City University of New York. That was extraordinary. So free education, K through college at the time. That has changed, unfortunately. Okay, let me just get my bearings. Okay, one of the things I want to go back to, and this is actually the St. Louis. This was a boat that was carrying refugees from Nazi Germany. They had visas to go to Cuba, and for some reason, bureaucratic snafu or corruption, they got to Cuba, and the Cubans wouldn't let them in. So they were stuck. They were stuck in the harbor, and they appealed to Roosevelt to let them in. They were fleeing. This is actually before the Germans had invaded France, but they knew what was coming, and Roosevelt refused them entry, and they did go back they sailed back to Europe, and about a quarter of them were killed in the Holocaust. So again, America has, not only does it have a history of having discriminatory immigration policies, but when we have immigrants at our doorstep, refugees that are fleeing, we've closed the doors to them. Okay. So, let's see. Okay. I just need to get my thoughts. Any questions so far? Any thoughts? Jane?
When did you become a U.S. citizen?
Okay, yeah, good. In 1960, I became a U.S. citizen. You have to be in the country, I think, 5 years. And you do, at the time, I didn't have to pass a citizenship test, but there is a citizenship test that, I'm not sure if my parents did either, but there is now a citizenship test that immigrants who are becoming citizens have to take. If you ever want to try it out, go on, Google it, and you'll see I could state with good assurance that most Americans would not be able to pass this test. Okay. So essentially, my mother had really extraordinary memory, and she knew her family history really well. She knew when my grandmother was born. I told you, in Otsvichin. When it came to my grandfather, that was a mystery. She knew that he was born in a town in Poland called Żanów, pronounced Janov. And when I went online to try to find Żanów, I found 6 Żanows in Poland. So what happened, and my grandfather disappeared during World War II. We knew from the family that he had been in Italy, that he'd been trying to get out. He was trying to get to Israel, was not able to do so. We don't know what happened to him. It's still. So anyway, I had decided in my retirement that I was going to finally do the research that would uncover what happened to my grandfather and the rest of the family history. And sometimes when you kind of open up the universe like this, the universe responds. Not a couple of weeks, a month after I made this declaration to myself that I wanted to find out about my family history, I get a strange email, and the email is labeled Leopold Elter, and the only people that in this world that know who Leopold Elter is are my immediate family. So I was intrigued. I looked at who wrote the email, and it was somebody from the University of Heidelberg. Well, essentially, this is the beginning of the letter. I'll let you read it. It came out of nowhere. It literally came out of nowhere. And I'll just paraphrase what happened here. He basically was a history professor at the University of Heidelberg, and he was doing research on how Germans were treating immigrants during the Weimar Republic. This is the republic between the end of World War I and the rise of Hitler, 1933. It was a time of great democratization in Germany. There was extraordinary arts flourishing, but there was also a lot of immigration. And he wanted to understand what was happening then in order to contrast how Germany is treating immigrants today. And of course, Germany was one of the few countries that has really stepped up in allowing almost 1 million refugees to come in from Syria. And essentially, during this research, he discovered documents about my family. And what unfolded was a whole trove of documents that I never would have ever found, because some of these documents were in the state archives of the state. Germany is split up into 16 states. None of this stuff has been digitized. And what ensued was a correspondence between the both of us. And the point of what he was trying to do, he was in the public history department. This is something that is new to me. I was a history major in college. And essentially, he wanted to create 4 case studies of immigrants during the Weimar Republic, and have a theater company produce a play, and which is what he did. But he did uncover exactly what happened to my grandfather and where he was born. Actually, we found out where he was born. He was born in a town that was pronounced Janov, except it was spelled in Polish, actually in English letters, Chrzanow, pronounced Janov. That town, it turned out, was about 10 miles from where my grandmother was born, so it made sense. They met in Poland somewhere, and then came to Germany in 1910. I went on to Ancestry.com and found, with very little difficulty, I found their wedding certificate. So it's another one of these seek and you shall find tales. I had never thought of going on to Ancestry.com, didn't think anything I'd find, and there it was, their wedding certificate. You're probably wondering how he found me. Anyone have any ideas? Well, it turns out when my mother died, she was living in Portland. She was living at the Atrium, and the Atrium produced a newsletter. I wrote her obituary, and as he was going through all these documents, discovered my mother's name, and basically did a Google search. Up came this memorial from Portland, Maine, and there was a link to me, and that's how he found me. So I did find out what happened to my grandfather. We also did find out that he'd been incarcerated in a number of camps in Italy. Italy was kind of unique. It was part of the Axis. Italy was under Mussolini, but Italy did not have a very strong anti-Semitic history. Not like France, not like many of the other European countries. And Mussolini really wasn't interested in killing Jews. But because he was an ally of Hitler, they did incarcerate the Jews that were in Italy. By the way, there were Jews in Italy going back to Roman times, 2,000 years. And my grandfather did wind up in a few concentration camps in Italy, and I actually have found documentation of that on the list. And we did find out that he was murdered, he was shot somewhere in a town called Macerata, Italy, somewhere towards the end of the war. I need to follow up on that. I haven't done that and contact the community to see if he's buried there somewhere, but that is still one of the things that I haven't done. So anyway, last year, almost exactly at this time, Emily and I found ourselves going to Mannheim, Germany. It's not something I was expecting to do, but given that this communication with this professor at the University of Heidelberg was extraordinary, and they were going to be doing a presentation at the University of Heidelberg, we decided to go. So we flew into Frankfurt, took a train to Mannheim, and actually met my brother. He joined us. And this is the main train station in Mannheim, Germany. And the first thing that I encountered when I got out of the train station was one lone directional sign. You'll see there, Gurs, 1,170 kilometers. This was, to me, probably one of the most powerful memorials that I could have imagined. There is no other directional sign there. This is the train station where my mother and grandmother were deported to the concentration camp. They put the sign there to remind everybody who goes by there. Thousands of people go by this train station every day and see that sign and are reminded of what happened. Mannheim is a beautiful city, and we went to the museum there. And in the museum, I found this portrait of a woman who was apparently very wealthy. Her name was Helene Hecht. Now, I should also go back a little bit about history of Germany. Jews had been in Germany as early as about 300 AD. They came along with the Romans, Mannheim, like many parts of Germany, was a class society. So there were Jews that were very, very wealthy. They were professionals. They were doctors, lawyers, engineers, bankers. She was the wife of a very, very wealthy banker. But when that deportation order that my mother and grandmother were subject to on October 22nd, 1940, anyone that was left, including the wealthy, were told to assemble a suitcase, within 20, and basically marched to the train station. The caption was very, very powerful for me. She was rousted from bed on the morning, brought to the collection point, but she never arrived. She died along the way. My mother actually describes her time in Gurs because she was there she was very poor, her mother was poor, but they were very wealthy Jews that were deported, those who didn't get out. And she did, one thing that she remembers very vividly is the Jews that were very wealthy were the ones that died first. They were just not used to the deprivations and lack of food and hygiene, and she would have not actually made it there. I'm going to talk about memorials because this is an important issue that I think is relevant to today. This is a memorial that city of Mannheim placed in the downtown. This would be the equivalent of 34th Street and 5th Avenue. This is not an obscure location, 12-foot by 12-foot cube, and it's transparent with the names of all the Jews from Mannheim that were deported and killed, including my grandparents and my uncle. One of the ironies is right on this block there was a department store that was Jewish owned. It was the largest department store in Mannheim, and this memorial is right outside that cube. Outside. This is something that is now being installed all over Europe. They're called Stoppelstein, and essentially what they are brass plaques that are put in the sidewalks in front of homes where Jews lived. And it says, here lived Ilse Cohen, born Joseph, born 1902, deported 1943, killed in Auschwitz. These stones are now being, as I said, done all over Europe. So between the memorial that I showed you, this one, which is really not a memorial, but it turns out to be one, this one, and this one, the Germans have done an extraordinary job at truth and reconciliation. In order to deal with the Holocaust, the Germans have done really as extraordinary job as you can imagine. First thing they have to do is tell the truth, and they have acknowledged the truth. The German government does not, paid reparations to Israel, to individuals, including my mother, and basically they teach Holocaust history. They banned Nazi symbols. They banned the Nazi flag. Up until very recently, Mein Kampf was banned. And this is the first step in truth, in reconciliation, is to tell the truth. This did not happen in France until at least 30 years, 40 years after the war ended. The Germans have done this way before. And these Stolpersteine now in front of houses everywhere. So Germans, Europeans, this is not just in Germany, everywhere they go, they are reminded that there were Jews that lived there, that were either deported to concentration camps, or some of them actually, stones also memorialize people who escaped, got out to different places. I contrast this with U.S. memorials to Confederates. This is, of course, we have not in America acknowledged the truth of the Civil War. We have not acknowledged the truth of Reconstruction, of slavery, and the memorials that were established to perpetrators rather than to victims. This is why we're still fighting the Civil War, and it's tragic. But this is not the case in Germany. So this is the brochure that was produced by the University of Heidelberg. The production was extraordinary. I have a clip here, and I'm going to show you just a little bit of it, just so that you get a feeling of it. It was in German, and they treated us, first of all, I want to say that we were treated with incredible dignity and respect on our trip there. And they provided there were 4 young women who were translators, who were in a separate little office. We had headphones, and so while this production was going on, we could hear instantaneous translations. It was extraordinary. And one of the case stories was my family. And the documents, they actually read the documents that were uncovered in those archives. So let me see if this works. I won't do this very long because it's in German, but it'll give you a sense of the production.
Da seien wir gewesen, haben wir gehandelt mit Leid. Einer ist von uns gestorben, seien wir geblieben, nein. Nein, Brüder, seien wir gewesen, haben wir gehandelt mit Fracht. Einer ist von uns gestorben, seien wir geblieben, acht.
Das Ding, das Sie Europa nennen, ist ein Lappen von bunten Flicken geworden. Und jeder ist fremd, wenn er nur die Nase aus seinem Dorf heraussteckt.
Hinter dem Vorhang, der östlich der Weichsel gelegenes Land verhält. Mordet man das jüdische Volk. Gemordet werden Jugendlichen östlich der Nord. Ihre Taten unterscheiden sich in der Sprache. Der losgelassene Faschismus verbindet sich.
In Wilna, in Polen, in Weißrussland wird gemordet.
Auch der Matja mordet. Die Tschechen zuckten in den Fingern.
Aber am entfesselsten wird sich der Kleinrusse auf die Wehr los.
Über ganz Europa geht jetzt eine Welle jüdischer Wanderer. Es ziehen sich lang.
Okay, I had been trying to, unfortunately this was, it was videotaped, but there are no subtitles, and I've been trying to get subtitles included in this because it was very powerful. Imagine they're reading official documents, and it was anything but dry. They had archival photographs, a small orchestra playing, and it was very moving, again, because some of the documents related to my own family. And I would love to be able to get the whole production here and show it with the subtitles. Because, out of here, one of the, okay, This view again. Okay. So this is basically the message that was given during the Weimar Republic about the immigrants that were coming to Germany then. Now I'm going to back up and tell you a little bit of other history. Why were there immigrants coming to the Weimar Republic during that period? Well, during the late 1880s into pre-World War I, there were horrific pogroms in Russia. Essentially, pogroms were massacres done by citizens against in this case, Jews, and Jews were fleeing. Some of the largest immigration to the United States of Russian Jews was during this period, while they were also coming to Germany. And my grandparents that were in Galicia, that part of Poland that is was part of Austria-Hungary, probably were fleeing as well. Not only were looking for economic opportunity in Germany, but were sort of seeing what was happening in other parts of Russia and were fleeing to Germany. Germany was one of those places where the immigrants went. And if you read these reasons why they didn't want immigrants into Germany, it's exactly the story of today into our country. So that brings us to today. I'm really jumping around quite a bit. We do not have many immigrants that I know of in the Bethel area, but we actually, even in here we do. I know at least 2 or 3 in this audience. But this is a report that was published about discrimination in Maine schools. In Maine schools, this is a current report, and because in Portland, it is an international city. There are something like 50 or 60 languages spoken in Portland, and there are many high schools and schools in Portland, in Maine, where we have immigrants. And unfortunately, they are not being treated as well as they should be. This is a concern. They are being bullied. I have to say that even in my own experience, growing up in Brooklyn, among children whose parents were immigrants or grandparents, I was taunted as not being an immigrant. This is just what kids do, unfortunately. But it's damaging. It's extremely damaging. And one of the problems that we're facing in America, in Maine, right now, is demographically, and I look around this audience, and you're telling me the basic premise. We're aging, and we are not attracting young people. In fact, our young people are leaving. My daughter is one of those. She lives in California. I think, if I look around the audience here, I can see a lot of friends whose kids have left as well. This report basically states the obvious, that we need immigrants to Maine. Maine is one of those states that we will not survive economically if we don't have immigrants. Now, they can be immigrants from other countries, they can be immigrants from other states, but Maine is not really, other than retirees, Maine is not bringing in a lot of new young people. And this report basically goes over that. These are quotes from that report. So this is really economic survival at this point. Now, I don't know what can be done to bring immigrants to this area. I mean, this area is a little difficult because, again, lack of jobs and transportation is a problem. But certainly, there are many main cities where this would be really beneficial. And if any of you know what's happening in Lewiston, Auburn, there's been a significant Somali population that has come into Lewiston,
And they have really been responsible for a resurgence of that Main Street. It's been really it's been a great boon to that city. Whoops. Well, actually, you know, let me say something about this very briefly, because this is something I wasn't sure I was going to put in, but I'm going to do it. Stars and bars. How many of you know, and this is, again, talking about symbols, because symbols are powerful, and symbols are what are used as, unfortunately, the basis for discrimination. How many of you know that this was the symbol at Telstar until 1992? Does everybody know that? It's a shameful part of our history. I'm embarrassed about it. I can't believe it happened. It continued until a very brave teacher, Rodney Abbott, wrote a letter to the student body. I have that letter if anybody's interested in reading it. It is about as powerful a letter as I've ever read about symbols and about this flag and about how important it is that we deal with truth. Because the reason that this symbol was being shown, was being used at Telstar, was because people didn't understand what it meant. They did not understand what it meant. It was really very naive. And it's because of our lack of good education, and because even in the South, that symbol was, this was, by the way, not the Confederate flag, this was a battle flag, a very unique battle flag. But if anybody wants to read that letter, I think it's something that I would love this community to embrace more. And I think it's something that our high school and our school needs to understand, because it's part of our history that this was here. So with that, I will end. I had something else to show you, but I think I'll end it right here. And if there are any questions, this would be a good time for questions. Yes.
Could you put up the picture of the right?
Yeah, sure.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Ask for a photo of the marae. Well, it's just one part of it.
Why did you choose that?
Because that was the last place where I lived. Okay, that was our house. That was our house.
We spent a week in August 3 doors to the right of the church.
Say it again?
We spent a week in this August in an Airbnb 2 doors to the right
Oh,
of
no
the church.
kidding. Well, this is the house. One night, the one on the left, that was that last house that we lived in before we moved here. Wow. Okay. That's pretty ironic. Well, that park, did you see that park across the street? Yeah, and that's where that memorial is. And actually, there are memorials all over Paris showing where Jewish children were ripped out of their homes. Oh, there was one other little sort of ironic detail that I forgot to mention. Life is kind of unusual how it comes together. And one of the main ironies of my story is that if it wasn't for the Holocaust, I wouldn't be here. Very clear. My parents would not have been in France at the time, would not have ever met. I would not be here. One of the other kind of unusual ironies is that, and I found this out just recently, Emily's cousin, it's actually her father's cousin, so it's cousin once removed, was a B-17 bomber pilot in World War II. He was 22 years old, and he flew 33 bombing missions. He was on one of the bombing missions that flattened Cologne. If you've ever been to Cologne, Germany, the Allies flattened Cologne except for the cathedral. Well, it turns out that one of his bombing missions was to Ludwigshafen. Ludwigshafen was a city right across the river on the Rhine from Mannheim, where the mother was born. Ludwigshafen had one of the largest chemical companies in the world called BASF, still around. They have refineries all over the South. And the Allies targeted BASF because it was a chemical factory. And he was on the bombing mission that flattened, that bombed Ludwigshafen, likely also bombed Mannheim. Part of Mannheim was bombed as well. So, anyway, Bonnie?
What has been your brother's response to your history?
Well, my brother was in a kind of a unique situation because he was a hidden child. And he has a whole other set of memories. He came with us to Germany, and it was very, very healing for him. So he is now, he's 6 years older than I am. He's now embarking on his own personal journey of trying to find out about his father. There are documents about his father that he has, over the years, not done anything about, and he hopes to do some research about that. There's still lots of stories that, histories that have yet to be written because people haven't done the research. But he actually wound up staying in orphanages even after my parents got together. So it was very difficult for him. Very difficult. And he was actually, I'm going to tell you something very personal. Again, according to Jewish law and tradition, Jewish boys are circumcised at birth. You could not be circumcised during the war because that would have given it away. And he was circumcised later on as a young boy in Israel when he was like, I'm going to say like 10 or 11 years old. Any other questions or comments? Yes,
I'd just like to get your thoughts on why there was so much hatred of the Jews at that time. World War II, and not only in Germany, but also in Europe. Why? What are your thoughts on that?
It's too deep, too complicated. The anti-Semitism goes back centuries. It goes back centuries. And it is the classic scapegoating. All societies need somebody to scapegoat. If we don't scapegoat Jews, we scapegoat blacks, or we scapegoat Hispanics, or we scapegoat gays, or transgenders. I mean, it's just what the world does.
Marcel, do you have Rodney's letter?
Yes, I do.
Do you mind reading it to us?
Yes, if people would it's that powerful a letter.